The reason the Stockdale paradox is so great is when they asked Stockdale, what was the difference between those who lived and those who died? He was there for 7.5 years in the Hanoi Hilton, right? He was in solitary confinement for half of that. He had his legs broken 3 times. He was tortured mercilessly, 7.5 years. And he said, well, it's easy. The optimists were the ones who died, contrary to those studies, right? And the reason he said that, he said the optimists were the ones who said,
welcome to Ultra Habits. Here, we go under the hood with our guests to unpack the minutiae and to understand what processes and systems they engage or research that result in ultra-enhanced living.
Hey guys, it's RJ Singh from the Ultra Habits podcast, and I want to talk about our next guest that we're going to be having on the show, Shannon Polson. Now, Shannon is truly a badass. She is the first woman in the U.S. Army to charge the Apache helicopter, and she is the author of The Grit Factor, where she unpacks and investigates all things grit. Now, her book is super interesting. What she does is she interviews other women within the military branches to really go into how they evolved within their craft, how they got to the top of their craft within an organization that is typically heavily male dominated. The reason I really like her book and the material is she offers frameworks, right? So something is abstract and is difficult to really formulate a process on when we're talking about grit. She really designs a systemic way of creating and then sustaining grit. I really hope you enjoy this show, guys. Now, I really enjoyed my time with Shannon. I got a lot out of it personally for myself. Please do leave your reviews. We value your feedback. It helps us make this show more relevant, more pointed, and more impactful for all you guys out there. Take care. Peace.
Well, thank you, Shannon, for joining us. The first thing I'd like to talk to you about is grit and the dimensions of grit. Can we unpack this a little bit, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, by the way. It's terrific to be able to introduce the Grit Factor to you and to your audience. I'm incredibly happy to have it out in the world. And, you know, when I started to do the interviews for the Grit Factor now a number of years ago, it was at the request of a young lieutenant who was beginning the same process that I had done a number of years before, going to Fort Rucker, Alabama to start flight school for the Army and then go out and be an aviation leader. And I thought immediately that I would love to help her. But my experience was somewhat unique because I was one of the first women to fly the Apache helicopter. And so that integration must have been somewhat unique, but also my experience is my own. And so I wondered how I could scale the advice that I gave to her. And if I did the work to do that, how do I scale the information that's available to others? And so that really was the genesis of what became the Grit Factor. I started a series of interviews of leaders in the vanguards of their fields. They happened to be women, they happened to be military. And this concept of grit is something that I grew up with from many, many decades ago now, and came out of all of these conversations, not so much as this discrete thing that we just pull off the shelf for mile 23 of the marathon, right? But really something that was more holistic. So I'm so glad that you asked the question because it breaks out into 3 phases, really: commit, learn, and launch. And those aspects of grit correspond really to owning our past, deeply engaging in our present, and then looking towards the future with that foundation and with that engagement. And I know we'll get into each of those areas here coming up.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really loved that you mentioned in the Grit Factor was grit is actually a skill. And, you know, I hear a lot of people, you know, David Goggins says something that I really love. He says, be your own hero.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe it's a military concept, but I think we live in a society where people attribute superpowers to everyone that does it. And what you're saying, it's actually a skill. Can we talk about that?
Yes, and I love that, be your own hero. I mean, it is really important to understand that grit is not just something for military pilots and big mountain climbers, right? But it's something that's innate to every single one of us. And it's both innate, but it's also a skill that can be built and developed. And that was something that came out of every one of these interviews. When you read through the Grit Factor, you read the stories, you read the research that supports it, and then you get the tactical takeaways. And in those stories, you'll find people that are as diverse as the population. They didn't all come in with hardcore athletic backgrounds. Some of them were exactly the opposite. And each one of them, as an individual, had to find that grit in themselves, but then also go through and develop that. And I really talk about developing grit as part of a mindset as well. So it is a skill that can be developed, and it's a skill that can be developed with the support of the appropriate mindset. And that mindset really is an understanding. This is spinning off of some of Carol Dweck's work at Stanford, of course, but understanding that we get better at doing hard things by doing hard things. And so with that understanding, armed with that knowledge, we can go into challenge or recognize being in the midst of challenge as something that's actually making us stronger and making us better. And that is proven time and time again to actually help us get through those times, to give us that perseverance that we need to get through, to give us that grit and to build that grit. And those are by taking small steps, right? Incrementally more difficult steps. When something huge is thrown at you that you have to maneuver through, and you move through that, recognizing the strength that you're building as part of that process is a huge help in that maneuvering. But the second part of that really is, and I get into more detail in the grit factor, of course, is drawing from the Army's Master Resilience Training Program, which of course is all drawn from the University of Pennsylvania's positive psychology work. And there's some very small, distinct and discrete things that you can do that build grit, that build resilience. And they seem so small. They seem so insignificant, but it's the consistent application of those skills and of that practice that really allows you to continue to build those skills and that ability to exercise grit and resilience.
I love that. Competence builds confidence, right? And providing yourself illustrative examples that you've been able to surmount something historically, you can then leverage on that, right?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And that's why grit, the foundation of grit, the foundation of resilience, goes back to some pretty deep introspective work of really taking that raw material of your life, some of which you may have searched out, but some of which you were probably given without your consent and you wouldn't have asked for, and taking that raw material and then shaping that into the narrative that allows you to contribute in the way that you're best meant to be in this world. So that is some pretty deep introspective work, but it is absolutely foundational to grit and resilience.
Well, that dovetails right into what I wanted to talk about next, is knowing your story, and the power of your narrative is, I suppose, the beginning part of the journey. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, when I work with clients on this, and I sometimes will lead this as a workshop, I ask people to draw out what we can call your lifeline, or another client actually calls your journey line, which I really like that actually. I'm going to start to use that instead. So you draw out this journey line of your life from birth to present, and of course there's an arrow going towards the future. And then spend some time thinking about the events that most impacted you, the positive ones above the line, the negative ones below the line. Any large experience obviously will probably have a little bit of both. So that's only step one, though. That's step one. Step two is to go through all of those experiences and say, hey, what did I learn from this? It might be a place that you failed and then had to learn about where you had a weakness that you wanted to develop, or where you wanted to fill in from another place. It might be that you learned a value. It might be that you learned something that you wanted to leave behind. But what did you learn from each of those distinct events? And then go through a third time and assess at those learning points, at those inflection points, those points of inspiration or those points of difficulty, what was the value that you internalized as a result? And it may be a value of something that you decide to leave behind, but it may be a value that you carry forward as well. So write in those values as well. This is something that takes some time, as you can imagine. And then the last time or the fourth time through, you go through and see where you can see some coherence, some themes in those values, some themes in those stories that are places that you might want to connect, and then be able to draw that line through as you go towards the future to connect back to those values. So that's the very first piece of owning your story.
Yeah, there's so much in that. And you weaved in the real need for deep purpose. And there was a comment, I suppose, in the book that really resonated with me, was purpose is a bedrock to grit. So how does purpose interplay with grit in your view?
Oh gosh, so much. I mean, it's really, if I were to pull out, I love all of the themes that come out of this, but purpose might be one of the very most important. And it really is suggesting that we go beyond our why, right? And all of us have heard about this idea of starting with why, and it's a great place to start, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. And the reason is the answer to our why in a given situation often is specific to that situation or that challenge. But that doesn't really connect to a core purpose or a heart purpose. And I give one example. It's one of now several ways that I help clients work through this is the 5 whys, which is a manufacturing technique that Toyota developed, right? To drill down into the root cause of deficiency. But I like to suggest that when we really drill down into core purpose or heart purpose, it's asking ourselves why, why am I here? Why am I doing this thing? Not 1 time, but 5 times. And when I did that exercise for a particularly challenging point in my military service, I came to the concept of service itself. Not military service, not serving my country. That was the level up. But something that was agnostic of any of that, of the organization, of the situation. So service was something that I could really connect to. And when you tether yourself to that core purpose, when you anchor yourself in it, I like to think that you can negotiate through any kind of turbulence that might come your way. But it is really quite deep and impactful work. And as you get older, and then I've just had this conversation with another friend who's working on another book that's related to this. We were talking about how as you get older, that sense of purpose may become more nuanced. I now sort of think of myself as having this cross and 4 different purposes in that cross, and of which service is still one. But there are other things that are now of equal value and equal weight in my life. So, but that is critical work, and perhaps the most foundational work in owning your story. And all of this comes back to this idea, and I know, RJ, you're going to love this, how this resonates, but it's both an opportunity and a responsibility to really take that raw material and make it something that matters. And it is an opportunity every single one of us has, no matter what that raw material looks like. It can look pretty awful at times, but we have this opportunity, which means that we have that responsibility as well to mold it into something that allows us to contribute meaningfully.
And I suppose that's why the military does such a good job at pulling the best out of people, because there's a unification and a real spotlight on purpose and service and duty. And I think it's innate in every human being to really seek that and look for that. And I would say that for me, just without digressing too much, when I had a pivotal moment in my life when I changed my life and kind of started to transform out of addiction, what and how I came to that was by someone showing me an opportunity where I could start to define more purpose in my life. So up to that point, it had been everyone kind of bitching and telling me that I was living wrong, and it was, punishment through law and all this other kind of negative consequences. But ultimately what helped me change is when I was ready at rock bottom, but somebody kind of presented an opportunity that gave me purpose. So in many ways, purpose may be the antidote to depression and misery.
I really like that, RJ. I think it's so important. And whatever one's perspective is on spirituality or faith traditions, I am a Christian, so that's my faith tradition. But even if you don't find yourself connected to any specific tradition, finding yourself whatever base you can find in spirituality that has meaning for you, I think is really important. Because one of the things that our culture has done, and this is a whole nother tangent that's not in the grit factor, but is they've stripped away faith traditions because some people have acted badly. And it's too bad, because the faith tradition itself is incredibly powerful and important and meaningful. And I think we have to start to understand that if somebody does something bad, that doesn't mean the tradition is bad. It means that person has done something bad. And that's true in all walks of life. And of course, it's more complicated than that. But that spirituality, however you define that, is, I think, a pretty important thing. And with many of the leaders I interviewed, it's absolutely bedrock to who they are, and they wouldn't have been able to face the challenges they did without that connection. And for some, that means walking in the woods, right? I mean, it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but taking the time to honor that in you, I think, is an important piece of getting through these really hard times. But I really appreciate you sharing your story too.
No, look, I completely wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I have I had a conversation with a guest. Her name's Amelia Lati, and she studied under Angela Duckworth. And Amelia's specialty is this Finnish concept of sisu, which is a cousin of grit, but it's a bit different.
Yes, absolutely.
And we were talking about how during the period of Rene Descartes, we as human beings started to adapt a mechanized view of the world. It was like a clock, and we kind of disconnected from the sacred in many ways, and our ego elevated. And I would say that that's why many people I know that have grit have been through trauma, because that trauma points them towards spirituality, which ultimately gives them the strength to move through stuff, right?
I could not agree more. I think it's that whole Enlightenment period. It was critical in so many ways, but just like we tend to do in so many parts of our lives, we grabbed onto something and tossed everything else away, which was a huge mistake, and is I think wrong from every perspective. So that's fascinating. I'm looking forward to hearing that discussion.
Yeah, she's an interesting young woman. So I want to talk about drawing your circle, because you really start to move into elements of community with grit, where, I think the view has historically been held that grit is just something that's, you kind of evolve yourself. It's very introverted. But what you're saying is that a community and drawing your circle and having a strong support network actually enhances grit. Can you tell me how?
Oh gosh, it's so important. And when I think of the grit triad, and the book is organized into 3 sections: commit, learn, and launch. And I really think of this as this triad. Imagine a triangle. That commit phase is that owning our past, right? Now we get to learn, and learning is really this deep engagement in the present. And 2 out of 3 parts of the learn phase have to do with relationship. They have to do with building your team, and they have to do with active listening, which is very much, again, relational. And I think what is very, very clear in the research is that humans are relational beings, right? We need to connect to others in meaningful ways. We need to help others, and we need to be helped by others. And despite the fact that for all of the leaders that I interviewed, they often felt lonely. Loneliness is a theme that comes up because leadership is lonely, but being one of the only women in an environment where it's all men is extremely lonely. Being the minority in any majority field, right? So this applies far beyond gender as well. It's a lonely place to be. But every single one of them would say, despite that feeling and that experience of loneliness, they couldn't have done it by themselves. They had to have a team in some sort. Now, that team doesn't necessarily mean the team that was at work, but we look at, you look at the people that are very special to you, whether it's a spouse or a partner or a best friend, somebody that you can have that complete transparency with, that total vulnerability. But there's also these other relationships, right? Like a colleague that you can trust, like a mentor that you can really trust and lean on for more strategic decisions. We tend to think of that as a strategic role versus a more tactical role, but really thinking about who fits in those places for an individual is a really important, again, somewhat introspective task for something that recognizes that this work is not all introspective. It is relational work. And it's both what we can learn from others, but also what we can give to others. That it's a reciprocal sort of a relationship that allows us to be strong enough to access and to build grit and resilience in ourselves.
I'm going to digress for a second. You're
great. I love that.
Well, your book, my response to the way that you handled misogyny was you were very graceful, and there was not a hint of resentment. Like, there was just throughout the book, you brought it back to you and how you would respond to the environment. And as someone that's just recently had a daughter, I was talking to my wife about how much I want her to have visibility or have discussions about inequalities in sex, or whether I just want to raise her to not even see it, just to go out there and do what you want to do. What's your view on that?
Right. Well, I think I grew up with a mother who, she had many good traits, has many good traits, but one of the traits that she had that was perhaps not as helpful was one that said, oh, there's no different, I don't know why women complain all the time. They have the same opportunities as men do. And I think it left me somewhat ill prepared. At the same time, you don't want to be hypersensitive, and you have to learn to pick your battles, right? So there is a balance for that, for sure. But I think that, I believe now that education is being a bit more thoughtful in how we present women and male leaders, and how we present women and men in history. And that's very important, and that's different from what it was when I was young. But I think having an understanding that things sometimes are not, she's going to experience it, right? So sending her out to just experience it herself is one way to do it. And but also a little bit of preparation isn't a terrible thing, and I think you can have those conversations in a way that aren't too scary, or that don't create hypersensitivity, because that's not productive as either, obviously. But being able to say, hey, listen, sometimes there's some people that might need a little more education in how they work with people, and then exposing her to other women leaders or women in various fields, because I'm sure she may have many interests that really are representative of people who have negotiated these challenges well, will help to give her, again, kind of the concept of story that she can adopt for herself from other stories.
No, because whilst the Ultra Habits listener base is, I'm not going to say male or female, they're typically masculine orientated, and there's a lot of women that are that watch the show. I thought it was really interesting, and in terms of just your message, and something that I really wanted to talk about. I mean, at the beginning of the book, you mentioned how the book is going to be really valuable for men that lead women.
Yes,
men that have
absolutely.
daughters, and I found it to be very true. Yeah.
Well, good. Yeah, the lessons are not unique to being a woman at all. And in fact, my original intent was that this book not be positioned with my picture on it or with any gender references at all in the title or subtitle. I think ultimately the publisher did exactly the right thing for how it needs to go out into the world. But I will say that some of the things that have made me happiest is to hear from male leaders, not because they have daughters, not because of anything else, but just simply because these are solid leadership lessons that came from hard-earned experience. And they came from hard-earned experience from people who have had to negotiate not only the challenges that they were presented by the job, but at the exact same time, extreme challenge, oftentimes in the environment, and not being accepted or not being supported. And so they really were negotiating this successfully with a double challenge, or what we call a double crucible. And so those lessons are for men and women alike, absolutely. But for men who are, I guess the term is woke, I'm a little old to use it probably, but for those who want to be allies, which I am really grateful to hear more and more men talking about being allies in this process, then this is a great book to understand more about how people have had to negotiate that and how to be a better ally as well.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about listening like a leader. Now, this caught me off guard because I had no idea that listening related to grit, right? Like, so when I came across that chapter, I was like, okay, wow, where is this gonna go? So let's talk a little bit about that and the concept of observing, pausing, and engaging deep listening.
It caught me off guard too, I will tell you. The format of the book came from the interviews. It came from the leaders who so generously shared very candid stories, very candid takeaways. And so I wasn't expecting this at all to be anywhere, especially as its own chapter. But I think it comes out, and on reflection, it seems clear to me that this comes out because, number one, it's a skill that these are all people who are working in very execution-oriented environments, right? And every single one of them and myself held themselves to very high standards of execution. Most of your listeners, I think, are probably in the same same sort of mindset. And for those of us who have that kind of a tendency, which is great for a lot of things, and it gets stuff done, right? We also have a tendency to not listen very well. I mean, most people don't listen well, but maybe perhaps especially we who are execution oriented do not listen particularly well. And the reason it's important is it goes back to the relationships. is that at the end of the day, execution is best with a team. It's done best with a team. It's done best with a diverse team. And a diverse team will challenge us with different perspectives and different backgrounds and different approaches. And the only way that you can really capitalize on, and for lack of a better term, the power of that diversity and the power of that team is to be able to listen thoughtfully without immediately planning your response, which is what most of us do. As we're listening, we're planning our response. Instead of planning your response, stopping. There's just art and a science to this, right? And this is the science of it, is literally making yourself stop and pause and internalize what it is that you've heard before responding. And like we talk about in the grit factor, that might be seconds, but it might be minutes, and it might be days before you respond, to deeply, truly internalize what it is that you've heard, especially if it's challenging. So I think it's because it is so foundational to relationship, and relationship is so foundational to grit, that this really comes up as perhaps the most strategic leadership skill a leader can develop, and very intimately tied to grit.
Yeah, this is something we actually have later on in March, a deep listening expert on the show who actually comes out of marketing. And it's always been something quite difficult for me, A, because I'm super type A, B, I'm in client acquisition, so sales. So I always feel like I have to control the narrative and the frame.
Yeah.
And I always feel like
Right.
my frame needs to kind of like overpower everyone else's frame. And so it's a very difficult thing to implement, but something that I've been really trying to, I get in trouble by my wife all the time because she's like, you're not listening. Yeah, I can see you already, like, you're already thinking about, I'm sure we all do this, right? But yeah.
You're not alone in the world of husbands or wives, actually.
Yeah, so. No, I get my ass kicked all the time for that. So resilient.
But, in that, one of the things that I do outside of my work with grit and outside of my work with keynotes and facilitating leadership conversations is, as a nonprofit leader, I have been working to build a library in our local community, and I've had to teach myself about fundraising. And we've raised almost $6 million now. The library's broken ground, but that fundraising, which I think of very much as client acquisition in a sense, what I had to learn was you've got to let the other person tell their story and then connect that story to raising the money. And if that person has nothing, and most people have a story that connects to libraries, right? Or if they don't, they really ought to. I judge them if they don't. But if they don't, then say, hey, you know what? You're really excited about rescuing homeless cats. Let me tell you about this other organization, and let's make that connection for you. And then, later on, they may come back to you and say, you know what? I was really thinking about this, because you honored what was valuable to them by listening and making that connection. And if you can make the connection to your work, that's great. You've got a client for life and you've connected their own story for them, but you've honored them regardless. And I think that results in referrals, and that results in people coming back to you perhaps at a different time. So that was really helpful for me to learn in the concept of raising the money for the library.
I think if I'm being super honest, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and sounding like a jerk, but in the client acquisition process, I'm doing it because it's contrived, right? Sure. Like but to be able to really authentically be curious when there's no gain for me, that's where things can get interesting, right? Like where I just have to be present in a conversation and curious. And I think that's really an area, because with time and time pressure, and you become so task orientated, it's like you're on the move and I got to go from here to there. It's like, sum it up in 5 minutes and let's move on. I'm sure you come from a world like that, right? And so it's.
Sure. Well, RJ, I can tell you how you close the sale. You close the sale by saying, I'd like to offer you a copy of the Grit Factor along with this.
I love it.
How do you like that? That's pretty good.
I love your energy. So let's move into resilience. So I know resilience is definitely related to grit. Let's talk about the Stockdale paradox.
Yes.
Tell us that story. It's really
this is next to story and purpose, my most favorite part of the whole book. And in fact, I'm doing a lot of additional work on this right now. But the Stockdale paradox is something that was coined, I believe, by Jim Collins when he interviewed him for his business classic, Good to Great. And so the concept is something of grounded optimism or measured optimism. And I am utterly and completely 100% passionate about this. I believe in it without reservation. Now Stockdale, because he was a Stoic, came at it with a little bit of levity. And I actually have talked to another POW that was also in the Hanoi Hilton with him who says, he was a Stoic, so he had to put his own spin on it. But at the end of the day, there are three different studies that looked at the POWs in Vietnam, those who survived, and those who came out and were able to successfully integrate into life afterwards. And all three studies by different agencies determined that the thing that was most important was optimism. That was what kept them alive. And that's what allowed them to successfully reintegrate. Now, Stockdale has, the reason the Stockdale paradox is so great is when they asked Stockdale, what was the difference between those who lived and those who died? He was there for 7.5 years in the Hanoi Hilton, right? He was in solitary confinement for half of that. He had his legs broken 3 times. He was tortured mercilessly, 7.5 years. And he said, well, it's easy. The optimists were the ones who died, contrary to those studies, right? And the reason he said that, he said the optimists were the ones who said, well, surely we'll be released by April. And April came and went and nothing changed. Or surely the war will be over by September. September came and went and nothing had changed. So what Stockdale says is you must never, ever lose faith that you will ultimately prevail in the end, which is faith you cannot afford to lose with a brutal confrontation of whatever the reality is that you face today. Sometimes that's a brutal reality. And so you have to accept that reality and confront that reality, but you can never, ever lose faith that you will ultimately prevail in the end. And that's what we call grounded optimism or measured optimism, which I think of as the circle that surrounds that grit triad. It's part of building grit and resilience, but it's also it has to be present and it holds everything together.
What is the interplay between gratitude and resilience? Because there you make another
Isn't
connection.
that fascinating?
Well, you made some connections there that aren't obvious. They're not necessarily obvious. Yeah.
They're not. And you hear about gratitude and you hear it come up here and there, and sometimes it feels a little wishy-washy, but it turns out gratitude is extremely powerful. This, by the way, connects back to spiritual traditions, if you don't mind me circling back to what is sacred, right? Every spiritual tradition has a subversion of yourself to something greater, and gratitude as part of that requirement. It's a requirement in those traditions. And it turns out that gratitude, and this is work again from the positive psychology work at University of Pennsylvania, that is actually a part of the Army's Master Resilience Training Program, which is a program not just for the soldiers that deployed, but for their families who are often without their loved ones, who are constantly deploying over the last 20 years or last 30 years. And it is this simple exercise of writing down at the end of each day 3 things that you're grateful for. And ideally focusing on each one for about 60 seconds, thinking why it is that you're grateful for them and perhaps even why you have them. But that simple practice that takes less than 5 minutes is shown to build grit and resilience. And it is, again, it's so simple. It just seems like it's such a small thing, but it's unbelievably powerful. And I think, I really believe we connect that back to ancient wisdom, which is something that I think, you know about as well.
So on a scale, you have people, we come across people in life that are super optimistic through to people that might be almost cynical or pessimistic, glass half empty. Is this stuff harder to apply to the cynics, or do the cynics have a doggedness through that cynicism that enables them to, what's your experience with that? Does someone have to be super positive?
I think cynicism is as the wimpy way out, honestly. It's easy to be a cynic, right? And you think you sound smart because you're like, oh, well, that would never happen. And I think cynics think they sound smart. And I obviously am biased against this, but it takes grit. It takes some strength of character to be an optimist, I think. But it's also, most importantly, and this goes back to owning our own story and drilling down to core purpose, it's also a choice. And it's a choice that we make every day. And if it's a bad day, we might have to make it every hour or every minute. And it doesn't mean you have to pretend that a bad thing is good, right? This again is this ultimate faith in the end. But it is a choice that we decide to make. And in my mind, the cynics are the ones who are not doing the hard work, and they're not doing the good work, because optimism is good for you, but it's good for everyone around you as well. And so if you're going to do the good work and be a positive force in this world, that's worth, I think it's work that we're all called to do, is to be hopeful, to be optimistic. And again, that doesn't mean to be a Pollyanna, but that does mean to go forward and be able to adapt to changing circumstances, to be able to get back up once you fall down, to honor the challenges for sure, but to be able to ultimately move forward and looking upward.
One of my favorite parts in your book is this whole piece on self-regulation. I think especially as a man, like I live in the business community, and I come across my peers and men, and I've got my view on how I feel a lot of men, we can typically make excuses for suboptimal behavior and acting like pigs, to be quite honest. And I think that for me, having a charter is super important, a personal charter. And that's really anchored by self-regulation. Let's talk about self-regulation, because I love it.
Yeah, no, I can tell that you do by the fact that you drink hot water all day as well. But I also want to hear about your charter, because I love that. And that's not from the book, that's from you. And I want to hear about it. No, it's an important thing. And these are choices that we make. And I think that's the important thing. I think one of the most frustrating and damaging beliefs that it appears that a lot of the world operates under is that we should just be handed things, and we should just be handed love, or we should just be handed democracy, or we should just be handed anything without being active participants. And the reality is we have to be active participants in our lives, in democracy, in a loving relationship, in anything that's worthwhile requires our active participation. And we're meant to be active in that role. And self-regulation is part of that. I just got off the phone today. It was actually a call totally out of the blue from somebody I served in the Army with 23 years ago. And I made a comment about the fact that the Army still has a long way to go with how they're treating women. And he said, really? Do you think so? I think there's more women that are doing these things. I said, it's not about that there are more women doing these things. I mean, if the statistics on sexual assault and harassment are horrendous, and they're worse than they have been for a long time. And he made this comment that he said, well, it's an environment where it's not always the smartest people, and it's a tough environment. And I was like, yeah, that's an excuse.
You were getting stirred up.
It's like, let's change that topic.
Yeah, right.
Let's change that topic. So it is a choice, and it's a choice that's important to make so that we offer everybody the opportunity to contribute best in the world. And that means making sure that our contributions, our participation helps others and also reflects well on the process. And that does require some self-regulation. That requires some pretty specific work sometimes, as you know.
One of the biggest
I want to hear about your charter, though.
Well, I have a personal charter. It's actually, I do a journal every morning, the Stoic journal. And when I open it, I have my daily charter in there, which is courage, love, patience, grit, discipline, focus, tolerance, and compassion. So those are the kind of things that I read. I read it every morning, and I try to embody these things. One of that's what you just caught me off guard, but look, it's something that's super important to me, because I think it's that old saying: if you kind of don't stand for something, you fall for everything, and you float through life like a leaf in the wind. And that was primarily my problem growing up as a kid. I had so much ability, but I had no sense of true north. It seemed like kids around me they were grounded, and I kind of floated to whatever was yelling at me the loudest, because I had no real sense of self. Right. There was no strength of character. And so that's why it's so important for me now, right? And just, reflecting on that. So, this part on self-regulation is huge for me. And one of the parts in there that really resonated for me, and something that I actually am aware of in the day is energy management. So I look at everything in my life about where I put my focus and how I engage in different activities, whether it be work, family, my ultra endurance sport. I look at energy management is really key. And I think, for anyone that's reading your book, they're going to get a lot out of it. But I think for executives, especially, they're really, in my experience, in most of their lives, is an imbalance in terms of energy management. They're not analytical enough around how they're expanding their energy and return on energy, as I like to
Yes.
call it.
Yes.
So we'll move on to this concept of pursuing excellence in the face of fear, which really was unpacked in the chapter of Turn Your Nose to the Wind,
Yes.
which I thought was an excellent wordplay, given your experience as a Apache pilot. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, it's my favorite metaphor. And it just, I read something from Henry Ford that was similar, which I found later, but I love it. And it's, how I start every keynote. I talk about walking out on the tarmac that first day that I was going to fly the Apache helicopter, and it's cold and wintry and the sun isn't quite up. And even though it's lower Alabama, like Georgia's kind of sticky and in the most seasons actually, but it was chilly and I zipped up my flight jacket and I'm walking out towards this aircraft. And you probably know, your listeners probably know, but the Apache is the premier attack helicopter. It's 58 feet long, it's 18 feet wide, it's 12 feet high. On its wings hangs any combination of the 2.75-inch floating fin aerial rocket and the anti-tank Hellfire missile. On its nose are 3 different sight systems that see in day and night and infrared. And I walk out towards this aircraft and I think, gosh, who am I to be walking out towards this aircraft? I was an English major in college, and doubting myself in this process, even though I've trained for this, even though I've worked for it, I've requested it, I've earned this opportunity. And I had to decide on that moment to be better than the doubts that I was feeling and better than the doubts that I had heard people express about why women think they need to fly this aircraft anyway. And I talk about walking in up to it, putting my one foot up onto the wheel, the other foot up onto the forward avionics bay, opening that all glass cockpit, climbing into the cockpit, and then taxiing towards takeoff. And then I'll ask an audience, if we're live, if they know which way you take off in the Apache helicopter. And most people will say up, if they say anything at all. But in the Apache, like in any other aircraft, you turn the nose to face the wind. And when you use it the right way, that resistance helps you to rise. It's true in any aircraft. Sailors will know it too with boats, right? And facing the waves and taking those waves head on. But I really do think that is something that came out with every leader that I talked to. And partly these are minorities and majority fields, right? And all of us had an understanding that we not only had to perform, but we had to be the best. And we had to be among the best in the group where we were operating, because the judgment and the visibility was so high. And that pursuit of relentless pursuit of excellence and of performing, of taking care of other people, of doing the work and doing the work better than anyone would have expected was absolutely part of this facing the wind, facing into that resistance and excelling regardless.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. We talked to Joe DeSena, the founder of Spartan Races, and his view is that with all the push for efficiencies and modern day comfort, we don't actually have enough resistance in our lives. So he talked about this concept of manufactured adversity, which I now reflecting upon is what you guys are doing in the military during your training, right? It's manufactured adversity day in, day out, right?
That's right. Absolutely. No, that's absolutely true. It's interesting. I have friends that are Spartan racers and adventure racers, and some of them have asked. I've done some long course triathlon, but I sort of feel like I've already crawled through the mud under the barbed wire. I don't need to keep doing it, but I do get it. I mean, it connects to a part of us that needs to be passionately involved and fully physically involved in what we're doing. And you know this as an athlete, as an endurance athlete as well. But you're right. I mean, that's what I think the rise of all of this is, and these crazy tricks kids are doing on skis and snowboards and all this crazy stuff, but because everything else is so comfortable. And there's something unsettling about that.
Yeah.
And there's a whole nother tangent to that discussion, which is that there's a lot of the world that's not that comfortable, right? And it could be that therein lies the solution
Well,
to allowing all of us to share that a bit more. But
it was funny because what Joe said, he was like, if this was 250 years ago and we were on the Lewis and Clark expedition, I would say everyone needs more couches. But, so what he's saying is like, but we're not, right? So yeah, it's an interesting concept. So let's talk about the audacity to be yourself and the confidence, or developing confidence in the face of imposter syndrome, which I know everyone suffers from. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, and this is a hard thing because there's a couple of sides to it. One of those sides that creates the problem is that we all understand, and this goes back to that we're social creatures. We need to relate. We want to make people happy. And so walking into an environment, especially as a minority, there's a real tendency to accept that culture and to put it on. In the military, it's the requirements are extreme in that regard, right? But there is this desire and a requirement in part to be part of that culture. You want to only join a company or a place or an organization where that culture is in line with your values, because you will be required to operate within it, but to also adopt some of it. The challenge is when you adopt that at the expense of who you are or at the expense of your values. And I think that there are some of the leaders that I interviewed, and some of my own experience reflects adoption of a culture in a way that was not consistent with who we were authentically. And to do that is possible for a short period of time, but it's not sustainable. And nor does it allow you to contribute in the best way that you are there to contribute. And so it's really is this tricky balance of being able to operate and contribute meaningfully within the context that of a culture, any given culture, and yet still be true to who you are. For those leaders who were able to sustain a successful career, they found a way to operate in a way that was true to who they were. And I believe that cultures are starting to make some adoptions around this, but every time I think that we're through all of the challenge of it, I'll talk to a whole new industry that is nowhere near that. So it's still a challenge. It's a challenge anywhere that there is a clear majority of one kind of person and not of another kind of person. And that's really true everywhere, right? Isn't it? So that is the trick, is to be authentic to who you are, which allows you to contribute fully what you're able to give and to build and to develop, and yet to do it within the constructs of a culture that you may have to negotiate.
Yeah. Personally, that really, really rings home for me. I mean, business and commerce, and maybe it's the industry and what my business does, it doesn't engage my senses in the way that it used to. And what I find is I've had to do things like the Ultra Habits podcast, endurance running, to really help sustain the energy in my business. My other directors used to think I was crazy, and they were, quite frankly, always worried that my focus wasn't within the business. But what they've come to realize is by me engaging all these external, and I have to balance it, sure, but it enables me to stay more focused at and in my job, because the reality is that, if I were to look at authenticity and whether or not what I do really aligns with who I am and where I'm not, the answer is no. But that's okay too.
Yep.
But I'm finding it elsewhere, right?
Yes. That is, I just sent out a newsletter to my newsletter list today. They're just short little snippets of thought on things. And I was talking about Einstein's violin. For those who don't know, Einstein was an avid violinist. I mean, really almost at performance level. But it wasn't just an interest. He would go and play music while he was developing whatever scientific theories he was working on. They were part and parcel of the same. And that's where you have this unique contribution when you honor who you are, right? When you honor that part of you that needs to go out and run 100 miles or however far you run, you are honoring that part that brings a unique perspective and a unique contribution. And I I'm hopeful that we're starting to understand that more and starting to value that more as you can bring those contributions forward in meaningful ways. But it is really important to honor that. I would say that I left the military in part because I felt like the creative part of me was utterly, completely stifled. And I realized it was critical to who I was. And now that might be shame on me for not finding a way to fulfill that within the context of that role, perhaps. But then I moved into a corporate role and I felt somewhat similarly. So I did the same thing to myself in a different role. And just to your point, I had to find ways to express these things to develop actually what it is that I'm doing now, which is taking the leadership concept and the writing and the speaking and the creation piece of that, which is so life-giving to me, which allows me to give life to others, right? So you're absolutely right. You have to continue to kind of work with that material until you find that right balance based on who it is that you are. And that allows you to contribute incredibly fully, which is both better for you and better for the world around you.
Yeah, just to close on that, like I used to think that you were going to be more successful in a function by throwing all your energy into that function. But what I've realized over time through faith and trust is that by having and filling my cup in other areas, it actually brings more competence and capability into my work. And the customers can feel that, people around me can feel that. And,
yes,
I get into arguments with my other directors sometimes because I will quite frankly say, I talk about energy management and people will take that as I'm not giving everything I got. Like they want everything in the tank. And I'm like, well,
yeah.
you're getting the best of me, but I need to be filling my cup via other areas to really continue to add the value that you want from me. But I think most executives are still lost in this world where I got to just empty the tank every day, right? Because that's really working hard.
It's not sustainable, is it? I mean, they'll lose their best people if they continue with that approach. And if your best people, by the way, give you everything and neglect their families or neglect their health, then you've lost them too, right? Because they will become much worse performers if they lose their family or if they lose their health. And yeah, it doesn't make any sense. So I'm hopeful that we continue this conversation. I'm so grateful you brought that up. It is critical to fill. I love that, filling your cup, right? Filling your bucket, filling up who you are so that you can give back in the most meaningful ways and to the best of your capacity. It's really important. And I'm glad to hear that you're doing that well.
Well, yeah, look, and it takes courage to basically challenge your environment. And you know what? It actually, it dovetails into the next topic beautifully of turning down the noise. Like that's that, you know what I'd like you to tell us the story of when you were in the helicopter and they locked on you. Cause I think that's the best illustrated example of this concept.
Yeah, and another good metaphor, and we can get into the realities of it as well. But that story takes place in Bosnia, and it was the second platoon that I had led. It was with a whole new battalion. We deployed to Bosnia in 1997. It was part of the NATO Stabilization Force, so S4, and we were there to support the Dayton Peace Accords. So the rules of engagement had just changed after the initial force, which meant that they were more restrictive because they were working to mitigate the impact on the civilian population. So we had a hard deck, or the lowest altitude that we could fly was 300 feet, which for a helicopter is very high because we're relatively slow moving. So that makes us really easy targets for any kind of anything coming from the ground, but including anti-aircraft and surface-to-air missiles and shoulder-mounted missiles and even small arms fire. But that was still the rule of engagement. So there was no ability to do anything outside of that. So we started out on a mission, and it was fairly early on in the deployment. We're flying at night. We always flew at night because that's a core competency, is flying under infrared. Luckily, the Mediterranean, Bosnia's Mediterranean climate, so it's very hot during the day and it cools off at night, and that makes that infrared picture absolutely gorgeous. But we're flying up in Multinational Division North. I'm in the front seat of the Apache, so I'm making calls down to all of the ground units, all of the NATO ground units, and we get to the place where we're meant to come to a high hover and do a reconnaissance of a Serbian heavy weapons storage site. And that means we had to come to a hover at 300 feet because that's the lowest altitude that we're allowed to fly. And as we slowed the helicopter to come to that hover, the sound in our helmets changed. And we were being tracked by one of the most lethal anti-aircraft systems in the world. And my backseater and I both puckered quite a bit. He said, LT, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to break the hard deck? And I said, don't break the hard deck, hold tight. I made a call up to the controlling agency, and that's the agency that controls all of the aviation operations and sector, and said, this is Blue Max 56, this is our location. We're being tracked by the most lethal anti-aircraft system in the world. And as we waited for the reply, the sound in our helmets changed again. And now we had been acquired by the same system, which meant that if they fired, we would be killed. Just then, the controlling agency came back on the radio and said, if you're worried, if you're nervous, you can return to station, but don't break the hard deck. Well, nervous? Yeah, we were definitely nervous. And we had to make a decision in a couple of seconds. And that decision, I just was talking to somebody recently, that's informed by years of training, right? It's informed by hours and hours of briefing. It's informed by understanding that we can't break the rules of engagement, or we'll be grounded and investigated and possibly sent home. It's informed by knowing that provocation was more likely than actual engagement. And so in that moment, we had to make a decision, and we reached over and I turned down the volume on that threat radar tracker. And that's the way that we flew the rest of the time in country. And I use that metaphor because I think that whether or not you've been in the Apache, whether or not you've been in any aircraft like the Apache, any other military or private aircraft, all of us are in our own cockpits one way or the other. And when you're in your own cockpit, you have so many things coming at you all the time, right? We have emails and text messages and, my gosh, Zoom calls now, and we have conferences and we have meetings and we have endless things coming into that headset that we have to respond to, not to mention that we have a soccer game to attend and an elderly relative to take care of and whatever your wife wanted you to pick up and bring home for dinner, right? And so you've got to decide, at some point, you've got to decide, in order to stay focused on the mission, like what you've got in the front of your journal there, right? In order to stay focused on what's important, to stay connected to that core purpose, you've got to be willing to reach over and turn down the volume. You've got to stay focused on what matters most and understand that if it doesn't matter the most, then it may not matter. And I always tell people, I did not tell you to not listen to your boss, but that might mean you have to have a conversation with your boss about, hey, there's 25 things that I'm expected to give to you in the next 2 weeks. Which 5 do you want me to focus on? And help your boss help you make that decision if that's the role that you're in. But as a leader or as a manager, help your people with that too. And that's helping to set boundaries on their work. I just spoke about this with a client that was really concerned about burnout. Like, that means don't schedule meetings before 9 or after 5, and don't send an email outside those hours either, expecting a response. Help your people set their boundaries and help them tune out that noise. It's such a critical thing to do.
I think that's the next part of a high performer's evolution. They go from people pleasing to a degree, and this over identification with this concept of being looked at as the can-do person, to really understanding, to sustain that, they have to set boundaries, and discipline with those boundaries is key, right?
Yes.
It's such an important point. Yes. There were so many gems in this book.
Maturity, really.
Huh? Sorry?
It's part of maturity, really, right? I mean, it gets easier as you get older, in part. Well, hopefully it does. If you actually mature into your age, it gets easier to just say, hey, I've got my family, I've got my work, and the rest of it's gravy if it happens, but that's what matters.
Yeah. I found kids have really given me probably the justification I needed, or the focus of prioritization that has to happen. Like, you have to become efficient.
Yes.
Or else you're gonna burn out. So especially, if you want to be a available parent, and I don't mean there in physical form, I mean there in energy, in mental capacity. There, I find I have to shut out a lot of external stuff to be able to maintain the level of energy required to do that, right?
Absolutely. And they deserve that. And you deserve that as a parent too, to have that connection. So that's an important thing to prioritize. Yeah.
Let's talk about extreme ownership. It's something that I see come out of the military a lot. I don't necessarily see it in the general walk of life. This concept of responsibility. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I like to call it the courage of ownership. I think it does take courage, absolutely. But it's also the fun thing. It's where, and I do find that there was more of it, or at least more understanding of its importance in my time in uniform. And there are times now when you'll work with a contractor and you're like, do you not understand that when you agree to do something, you do it well and you do it until it's complete. And that means if you have to stay up until midnight, that's what you do. And it's amazing to me that people don't understand that. But it was very much something not just drilled into us, but you'll understand as something that's it's an honor to be able to serve in that way, to be able to say, I am responsible for everything I do or fail to do. I am responsible for everything my team does or fails to do. And that's a critical component of leadership. If you ever hear political leaders saying it's not my responsibility, they're not a leader. That's not leadership. It is your responsibility. And it's your responsibility when it goes wrong, always. When it goes right, you should be spotlighting people on your team. That's the other part of leadership, right? Is it's not about you, it's about your team. But if your team messes up, you take the heat and fix it. And if something goes right, you deflect that light onto your team. And those are leadership traits that were more at least acknowledged in the military. You don't always see it.
So are you saying the military is there's less gamesmanship in terms of political play? And is that stuff called out? Like when people are managing up, is they doing corporate, like, do people call that out in the military?
Yeah, the word in the military, and I haven't been in the military now for 20 years, so just to be clear, it's been a while. And it happens everywhere. It happens in the military, it happens everywhere, in every walk of life. But it's called they used to call people who would go out and look for the credit for themselves a spotlight ranger, right? They would they're looking for the spotlight. The spotlight ranger is just the person that's going to do it if it's in the spotlight to get the credit. That's it. Yeah. And that's not leadership behavior. So no, that gamesmanship happens regardless. And I'm sure that the higher people go, the more it happens. I did 8 years and then moved into the MBA program and then into the corporate world. So, but it certainly is part of human nature. But the best leaders don't have any time for that.
And so how do one of the really interesting concepts at the close of the book was, and this now I understand comes from not only your view on service, but faith and spirituality, aligning grit for the greater good. And you had this statement in there, helping others versus blazing trails. Like, let's talk about this concept.
Yeah. Well, yesterday I was having a conversation again with a friend who's doing some research on another book in this general area. And we were talking about the sources of motivation. And as a young person, I think connecting to this concept of service and something bigger than yourself is important. But there's a piece of that was also adventure seeking and looking for something cool. And there's a fair amount of ego involved in that as well. And the ego, even in the attempt to subvert the ego, if that makes sense. But as a person gets older, again, I think this comes from maturity. The opportunity at least is there, that you don't always see this, but the opportunity is there to understand more and more that this is about contribution. It's about how you leave the world better for you having been here, hopefully. And it's dangerous to talk about virtues or talk about something like grit as a virtue full stop. It's not a virtue full stop. I mean, people have grit towards bad ends, right? People have courage towards bad ends. There's not a moral dimension to it by itself. So there's a great opportunity for all of us to say, how do we take these principles that are so powerful and apply a moral dimension to it? Now, that obviously goes beyond the scope of the grit factor, but I wanted to bring it up because you'd certainly see examples of people who are acting in a way that could be considered courageous or could be considered having grit and resilience, but they're doing bad things. And at the end of the day, that maxim of first do no harm might be something that we should be running everything by before we say that, hey, I'm showing courage because I'm going to display very specific political perspectives here because you're storming the U.S. Capitol. That's not courage towards good end. That's courage badly applied towards evil. And so it's very important as a culture that we not just hone in on the characteristic, but we understand that there is a moral dimension to our actions. And that's an important thing for us to start talking about a lot more in the climate that the whole world is facing.
That is such an interesting point, that grit not tempered with values and morals is powerful, but can ultimately result in a genocide. Some of your
Yes.
greatest leaders that were, I would imagine, in some countries that, have done a lot of harm to its people, they would have had a lot of grit. And so your point is well taken. Grit's agnostic to good or bad, isn't it?
Yes, it is. There isn't, it doesn't have any moral implications at all. And it's important for us to start recognizing the importance of moral implications in our actions and calling that out, and having a way to discuss that and to judge it, really, so that we are teaching people to make choices that are moral and good and for the common good. That's really key.
How does someone go from grit coming from a place of chip on the shoulder, I'll show you, to a place of more grace?
I hope in part by sharing stories of places where this happens and elevating those stories in a way that we can all learn from. This power of story is tremendous. It's how our brains process information neurologically. So the science is behind it, but also the ancient wisdom is behind it. Just to continue to circle back to our original comments there, all of the ancient wisdom is told in the form of story. And so if we can help to elevate those stories, I think that will be a really big part of it, and to tell those stories with those dimensions. But it is going to, at the end of the day, this comes back in part to individual responsibility and to leadership responsibility to set climates where the moral dimension is a part of it. And that's an opportunity for all of us and everybody who leads a team or an organization.
Well, look, Shannon, I think we'll close it there. It's been a remarkable interview, and there's so much more that we could have talked about. But I think really the goal was to unpack the primary stuff, the gems within the grit factor. And I think we did so successfully. So I just want to ask you before we sign off, where can listeners find you? Where can we find you?
Yeah. Thank you. You can find the Grit Factor anywhere that books are sold. Amazon, Bookshop, Barnes & Noble, any independent bookstore can order it for you as well. And I like to always put in a plug for your independent bookstores in your neighborhood because they're suffering right now. But I'm happy if you order it from anywhere. I'm available online at Shannon Polson, Polson.com, as well as thegritinstitute.com. And both of those will talk more about keynoting and leadership facilitation as well. I often play around show up on LinkedIn and Twitter. So I'd love to see you in any of those places.
Thank you so much again for your time, Shannon. It's been a really pleasurable interview.
Thank you, RJ. I've enjoyed it as well. Thanks for being willing to do some digressions. It makes it a lot more fun.
Yes, indeed.